Almost every day, gigantic forest fires spark and is a destructive force that nothing seems able to stop.
Un hectare de pinède qui brûle, ça peut être l'équivalent de la puissance d'une centrale nucléaire.
Tens of meters high and spreading over distances that can exceed 500 kilometers, wildfires threaten and destroy millions of people's lives.
I happened to look up and I saw our next door neighbor's trees exploding into flame. Everything behind was completely covered in sheets and walls of flame that 30 to 50 feet high.
Confronting the flames are firemen, but also scientists. They reveal the devastating power of wildfire and some of the most unbelievable phenomena, such as firestorms, enormous explosions of flames.
Une nappe de gaz se répand très vite et s'enflamme en quelques secondes sur une très grande surface.
Fire can run over treetops to overtake and encircle its victims. It can create its own wind to gain strength and speed, reaching record temperatures of more than 1,000 degrees Celsius, enough to melt gold. Also, vegetation serve as grenades to spread over hundreds of meters further.
Les pignes sont venues enflammées d'en face. Elles partaient comme des obus.
In order to tackle these powerful fires, firefighters and researchers have created increasingly efficient techniques. But with global warming, fires are increasingly monstrous and destructive.
Le risque d'incendie que l'on a actuellement dans le sud-est de la France pourrait s'étendre dès 2040 à la forêt des Landes et en 2060 à la forêt de Sologne.
So what are these wildfires like? What are their most extreme forms? What tools do they use to gain power? And above all, what does the future hold for us? Can we win the war against the flames? To find out, we go to the United States to study giant fires such as the Station Fire, a fire that destroyed an area the size of an English county.
Alors, on est effectivement sur ce qu'on appelle des mégafeux, à la fois par leur dimension et par leur puissance. Et ces quelques grands feux qu'on appelle des mégafeux sont des feux qui dépassent les capacités d'intervention humaine.
In France, some cities are becoming increasingly threatened by flames.
Nous avons une zone où la nature englobe la totalité de la ville de Marseille. Il est extrêmement compliqué de défendre et les personnes et les biens dans ces zones périurbaines.
In Portugal, we discover an increasingly common phenomenon, multiple outbreaks. These fires of the future see several hundreds of fires ravaging an area simultaneously.
Après, on est très vite impuissant parce qu'il y a tellement de choses qui brûlent par terre et tout que ça va très vite.
Flames as tall as buildings, total destruction of vast areas. Thanks to science, we discover everything there is to know about wildfire at the heart of the flames. Fire. It has always fascinated us, a valuable ally that has today become synonymous of destruction. 40 million hectares of land go up in smoke each year on average. That's the equivalent of Germany and Switzerland consumed every year. In recent years, forest fires have grown to unbelievable sizes. In Chile last winter, over 180,000 hectares were devastated in 2 months by a flame front which reached a width of 500 kilometers. In 2009, Australia saw the most deadly fire in its history, 231 deaths in an area of 365,000 hectares that was completely devastated. The equivalent of Belgium struck off the map. Facing these catastrophes are firemen who brave the flames from the front line, but there are also other firefighters who stay in the shadows and who make major advances against the phenomenon, scientists. They know its most destructive characteristics perfectly, as well as its most powerful allies, and among them, the worst is the wind.
I used to fight forest fires, and we often would say that if the wind was blowing more than about 25 or 30 miles an hour, there wasn't much you could do.
Scientists are doubling their efforts because fire is not like other natural phenomena. It has a very special relationship with man.
Il n'y a pas beaucoup de qu'on appelle catastrophes naturelles face auxquelles l'homme s'interpose. C'est l'une des rares, on ne va pas s'interposer face à une avalanche, un tremblement de terre. Là, sur le feu de forêt, l'homme a la prétention de s'interposer. Donc il est au cœur du dispositif, à l'amont en tant que responsable, et à l'aval pour corriger en quelque sorte ses fautes en luttant.
It doesn't take much for a fire to spark in the wild. In scientific terms, it is a phenomenon that relies on a well-known chemical reaction, combustion.
A fire basically needs three things to make it run. It needs an ignition, something that actually sparks it. It needs oxygen to be able to fuel the fire, and it needs fuels, wood or plant material to keep on burning.
The principle is simple. First, it's triggered by what researchers call activation energy. Then an oxidizer, generally oxygen present in the air, burns fuel, in other words, raw material. Activation energy, oxidizer, and fuel. These three elements are omnipresent in nature, especially in forests.
Un combustible, en l'occurrence la matière végétale dans le feu de forêt, un comburant, en l'occurrence l'oxygène de l'air, le vent dans le feu de forêt, et une énergie d'activation, c'est une étincelle initiale.
A spark, vegetation, and air is all that the flames require. Three types of fire can then arise. Ground fires that burn dead leaves and dry plant residues, surface fires that burn the lower parts of the vegetation, and crown fires which burn the tops of trees. Once triggered, the fire moves faster than a person on foot. Its propagation speed can go over 5 kilometers per hour, with rapid accelerations depending on the landform. However, there is another determining factor in creating a fire: humidity.
L'humidité de l'air, c'est très très important pour l'éclosion d'un feu. On sait très bien que dans des zones où on va avoir une humidité supérieure, on va dire à 50%, on va avoir des éclosions difficiles. Mais dès qu'on va atteindre le seuil inférieur à 27-26%, on aura des éclosions de feu très très faciles.
Below 26% is a recipe for disaster. It is a scientifically recognized fact. Air humidity plays an extremely important role. It has a direct effect on plants, making them highly flammable.
Lorsqu'on est sur une séquence de sécheresse longue et intense, la végétation, sa teneur en eau va être relativement faible et les plantes vont être d'autant plus combustibles.
Why do plants burn better when they are dry? In cases of severe drought, plants consume water which is contained in their own sap. What remains is evaporated into what scientists call volatile oils, extremely flammable gases. This means that the slightest spark can start a fire. Lots of trees and intense droughts for long periods of time provide the ideal conditions for wildfire. These extreme conditions are very high risk. And unfortunately, these conditions are present in a particular type of climate, the Mediterranean climate.
In Mediterranean climates, the conditions during the spring, summer, even into the fall are incredibly dry. Very low humidities, very high heat.
The heat and droughts in large forest areas make the Mediterranean climate a real tinderbox. This type of climate can be found in very specific parts of the globe.
Alors, c'est un climat dont le nom vient de la Méditerranée, donc les pays du pourtour méditerranéen, mais on retrouve ce type de climat en Afrique du Sud, en Californie, une partie du Chili, et une petite partie aussi de l'Australie.
High-risk zones that exist on almost every continent. And it's in California that one of the worst forest fires in the history of the United States took place, the Station Fire.
Le Station Fire, c'est un record. C'est un record parce qu'on est sur le plus grand feu du comté de Los Angeles.
While parts of the United States enjoy a similar climate to that of the south of France, its forests are beyond comparison. They cover an area the size of Europe. 80% of these forests are in the west of the country, and this is where the largest fires occur. They create what experts call megafires.
Alors, on est effectivement sur ce qu'on appelle des mégafeux, à la fois par leur dimension et par leur puissance. Et ces quelques grands feux qu'on appelle des mégafeux sont des feux qui dépassent les capacités d'intervention humaine.
The name megafire is a purely scientific term. To be classed as mega, a fire must spread over more than 10,000 hectares, an area the size of the city of Paris. This phenomenon is very rare in France, but not in the United States. On the scale of America's vast forests, these fires cover immense regions and can last for months. However, even taking into account the country's extreme cases, the 2009 station fire was out of the ordinary. We are in the heart of the Angeles National Forest, and yet we are in the county of Los Angeles. You wouldn't believe it, but it's just 45 minutes from the center of the city.
Many of course, the attractive qualities of a Mediterranean climate is it's a great place to live. And because of that, you have, I think within the LA Basin area, somewhere on the order of 7 to 8 million people with a lot of natural areas between those houses, right next to homes.
7 million people, that is a third of the population of Los Angeles, who live in the forests and hills to the north of the city, far from the image of Epinal highways, beaches and built-up areas. It was precisely to live in the middle of nature that Robert and Carolyn settled in the outskirts to the north of the city in Big Jahunga. Today there is nothing left of the couple's property. Everything started on the 26th of August 2009, a few kilometers away from here.
The station fire started on a Wednesday, further up the road, probably, 10 miles or so
10, 12 miles.
up the road on Angeles
Up the canyon.
Forest Highway.
It started from people putting out ashes from something that they had burned, and with those dry conditions and the low humidity, it took off.
Just a few embers were enough to light the biggest fire in the history of California. Whether intentional or not, it is man who is responsible for almost all forest fires.
Les feux d'origine naturelle liés aux orages secs, à la foudre, c'est 5 à 10% des causes de feu.
Most often, a fire starts on the ground, on the herbaceous layer, and grows on contact with bushes. From the shrubs, the flames easily reach the lower branches, then travel to the treetops. They call this the elevator effect. At first, the station fire was not very powerful. Experts were not concerned. They thought they had the fire under control and decided to let it burn.
The fire, when it started burning, did not look that threatening. And there is a policy often to, if it does not look like it's going to threaten homes, to let the fire burn as long as it's not in an extreme state.
This may seem shocking, but in Anglo-Saxon countries, the policy is to leave a fire alone, as it is good for some ecosystems. In fact, a large part of Mediterranean plant species could not even reproduce without fire. This is the case of Aleppo pine. In order to reproduce, it must disseminate its seeds, which are contained in its pine cones. The cones are sealed with resin and only open on contact with fire. Wildfire, like all natural phenomena, has a purpose. But the problem is that it also represents an enormous risk for humans. This is what happened in Los Angeles in 2009. While the station fire was still only a small bushfire, control was lost in just a few moments.
Unfortunately, what happened is then the weather conditions did change and the fire really took off and blew up at that point.
In Los Angeles, how did a small bushfire become so uncontrollable in just a few moments? It was thanks to the fire's best ally, wind. And not just any wind. In California, the most dangerous wind is called the Santa Ana.
The Santa Ana winds occur usually during very dry conditions when the temperature is still quite warm, often about 100 degrees. And the winds come from the east. They blow up over the mountains and out towards the coast. And they're very strong winds, often 50, 60 mile an hour winds.
The Santa Ana is the equivalent of the Mistral wind in France, but worse because it is dry. It comes directly from the desert. And the problem is that the fire's speed of propagation is directly linked to the speed of the wind.
Le sinistre progresse à 3% de la vitesse du vent. Donc effectivement, vous pouvez imaginer que pour un vent de 100 km/h, le feu peut se propager à 3000 mètres par heure.
3,000 meters, that's 30 football pitches in an hour. On that day in Los Angeles, the power of the fire escalated very quickly. It then moved westward.
So it jumped the highway up there and started burning down canyon towards us.
The fire even managed to cross the highway, and it's the wind that is responsible, as it caused what scientists call fire jumping.
Le vent peut transporter des particules incandescentes qui vont pouvoir allumer des sautes de feu en avant du front de flamme principal.
Burning twigs are transported by the wind across the road and burn the vegetation on the other side. These multiple fire jumps create so many new fire lines that they must be fought before they develop. The firefighters did not manage to extinguish them all. Although the wind speed slowed down, the fire continued its wild course. And even with the wind lessening, the flames drew closer to Robert and Carolyn's home. In 2 days, it traveled 30 kilometers, arriving at the top of the canyon where the couple live. Why such a fast pace when there was no wind?
No wind whatsoever, just a very warm day. And as we were standing there, a 50-mile-an-hour wind came from down canyon upward.
What Robert and Carolyn noticed was a phenomenon that scientists know very well. It was actually the fire itself that produced its own wind. To burn, the fire seeks to consume all available oxygen. It produces a suction effect like a giant vacuum cleaner, creating its own wind to fuel the flames.
Il y a un phénomène d'aspiration de tout l'air frais alentour, et notamment devant le front de flamme, qui génère des vents au sol qui peuvent être vraiment importants.
Once started, the fire no longer needed wind from the outside in order to advance. Robert and Carolyn did not immediately realize the gravity of the situation.
As I was coming outside, loading possessions into our horse trailer, one of our neighbors came running up and said, "You've got to get out, you have 5 minutes left." At that same moment, I happened to look up and I saw our next door neighbor's trees exploding into flame. Everything behind was completely covered in sheets and walls of flame that 30 to 50 feet high.
It was a full-blown emergency. The fire, which until then had been running along the ground, reached the treetops, the canopy.
Called a crown fire, and generally crown fires, when they happen in forests, it's a very dangerous situation to be in. The fire literally can run right over the top of you.
The flames move from tree to tree with increased power and speed as they are fueled by the enormous quantity of leaves.
Dès que le feu passe dans la strate arborée, devient un feu total, ce sont des feux qui ne sont plus contrôlables par les moyens humains.
For the couple, there was only one solution: to flee. Robert and Carolyn each leave in their cars, following one another, when suddenly Robert, who is in front, can no longer see his partner in the rear-view mirror.
I became very panicked. I wasn't sure if I should get out of the truck and run back, but I also realized if I were to get out of the truck, I would probably burn up.
And with good reason. The heat is tremendous. Indeed, when burning, plant life specific to the region produces record temperatures.
If you were burning a shrub that was not one of these chaparral species, it might have a temperature of 200 or 300 degrees Celsius when the fire burned. Temperatures in chaparral communities with these fire-dependent shrubs have been measured at 1,000 degrees.
1,000 degrees, that's gold melting temperature. Why such heat? Scientists discovered that these plants actually need fire and contain highly flammable gases. When they catch fire, these gases, called pyrophytes, raise the thermometer up to 5 times the temperature of an average fire. Luckily, Carolyn quickly joined her partner and they drove at breakneck speed at the heart of the fire. After a few hundred meters, Robert and Carolyn managed to get out of the canyon, finally leaving the blaze behind them. But the impact is catastrophic for the couple and their neighbors. No less than 50 houses were completely destroyed by the flames. Nearly all of the vegetation was devastated. So what explains such a level of destruction? The answer is simple yet surprising. It is by wanting to limit risks at all costs that we have created the conditions for these megafires that destroy everything.
Common problem that we now have in California and actually in all these Mediterranean climates is because of the danger of fire, people have put out fires.
And by preventing fires from regularly clearing the forests of bush and deadwood, we have created an enormous reservoir of fuel.
And because of that, when the fire does get in there and burn, it burns very, very hot. And if it burns hot enough, the fire will move out of just burning on the surface where it used to just kill the smaller trees. It will burn up into the crowns of the trees.
For scientists, this type of fire is categorized as a total fire. The heat which is emitted causes the trunks to burn, which normally resist flames, and the fire therefore climbs up to the treetops. Absolutely everything is destroyed. Total fire is a terrible disaster, but there is worse, what scientists call firestorms. This phenomenon occurs when the famous flammable gases released by plants are trapped in a natural basin.
Donc il y a un phénomène d'accumulation jusqu'au mélange détonnant qui, d'un seul coup, prend sur une grande nappe.
The gases are trapped by the natural landform, and when the concentration of gas is very high, everything explodes almost instantaneously. Luckily, there was no firestorm in Los Angeles in 2009, but the giant fire continued its progression towards the city center. Yet a few kilometers away, still nobody suspects the magnitude of the drama. Kathleen Sutherland lives less than 20 minutes away. For her, that day was fairly normal.
I heard about it on television, and at that time I wasn't worried. It was way that direction, so I wasn't thinking about it. I would drive home from work, I would come up the freeway, I could see some smoke down there. I never thought too much about it.
However, the fire continued to spread and drew closer to dense residential areas. So the county's 3,000 firefighters took things into their own hands. They ensured the safety of more than 3 million people spread over an area of 12,000 kilometers. And to fight the station fire, they received help from all over the country. Despite the incessant whirring of helicopters and the tremendous human resources deployed by the authorities, nothing succeeded in stopping the flames. The firefighters decided to attack the fire's basic elements. Remember that once it's alight, fire needs oxygen and fuel. And as it is impossible to deprive it of oxygen, it must be deprived of fuel, that is, of wood.
Well, the main way of fighting against fire in natural systems, both shrub communities and in forests, is to really eliminate the fuel. And the main way that that's done is either creating a trail, a break in the fuels around the perimeter of the fire.
To be sure that the trenches were wide enough to avoid fire jumping, the American firefighters used bulldozers. They went even further, lighting fires against the flames themselves. This is what experts call backfiring.
We now fight fire with fire, which proves to be very effective in that you can get out in front of the fire, light a fire, and let it slowly work its way back towards the wildfire, burning all of the fuel out so that when the wildfire gets to that point, it doesn't have anything to burn anymore.
The technique of backfiring is particularly effective, but it needs to be used in advance and it takes time. And time is exactly what the Los Angeles firefighters were lacking in September 2009. The fire was on the outskirts of the suburbs. Nearly 10,000 homes were under threat.
Each day as I was coming home, the smoke was coming closer and closer. So when the fire started to get really close, then I became frightened. And at that time, we got a phone call from the city of La Crescenta, and they said that we were on standby for evacuation because the fire was coming to our house.
In the end, nearly 25,000 people were evacuated. For the 5,000 mobilized firemen, the fight continued for many weeks. Finally, only the arrival of rain could put an end to the station fire, considered permanently extinguished on the 16th of October, almost 2 months after it started. The impact of this giant fire was substantial. More than 200 buildings were destroyed and an area of 65,000 hectares went up in smoke, the equivalent of a country like Singapore. An indirect consequence, the loss of vegetation on the hills around the city led to landslides and mudflow during the rains the following winter. This is for the giant fires in California, but what happens when a fire starts in France? While in France fires are common in summer, they are much less extensive than the station fire.
Le station fire, la surface totale de ce feu, 65 000 hectares, c'est la plus grande surface jamais atteinte en France sur une saison feu complète.
Megafires, are they possible in France? For a fire to be considered mega, most experts consider that it must exceed the threshold of 10,000 hectares. This has happened only once in France, in 1990 in Villeurbanne. In the Var, where vegetation fires stretched 11,580 hectares. But experts do not rule out this possibility, far from it.
On dispose des forêts qui permettraient d'avoir à terme ce type de feu. Par exemple, la Corse est une île extrêmement combustible. Il n'est pas exclu qu'un incendie en Corse aille d'une côte à l'autre.
And while megafires are not yet a reality in France, the country has seen some particularly dangerous fires in recent years, as flames have reached the gates of cities. France is covered by 16 million hectares of forest. While only 1/3 is considered by scientists to be susceptible to fire, that still represents 10% of the entire country. What's more, this type of forest is concentrated in one region, the southeast. The capital of this region is Marseille. The city is the country's second largest with a population of 900,000. It is surrounded by several mountains, nestled between the sea and the forests, an ideal position if there were no forest fires. At the end of July 2009, Marie Consenot was living in the Trois Ponts area in the east of the city.
C'était un été normal, hein? On a eu du beau temps, on a eu de la chaleur, on a eu de la pluie un peu, mais non.
But a normal summer in Marseille, in full Mediterranean climate, is already a dangerous situation.
Donc, le climat méditerranéen, c'est à la fois des températures importantes pendant la saison estivale et surtout une forte sécheresse. Une sécheresse qui dure pendant 2 ou 3 mois pendant la période estivale.
And during the summer of 2009, in 24 hours, everything changed. The fire found itself at the doors of Marie's home, a moment that will never disappear from her memory.
On a peur, on a toujours peur. Dès que je vois un hélicoptère tourner autour de la maison et des alentours, je dis toujours il y a le feu quelque part, quoi. Hein?
On the 22nd of July, less than 10 kilometers away from the city, a fire started in the Capillon military camp, sparked by a gunshot during training. At first, only a few bushes were on fire, but during summer in this region, the smallest spark can trigger a disaster.
En plein été, on arrive à des températures supérieures à 30 degrés Celsius. L'humidité de l'air va être réduite à 15 voire 18%. Et puis, on a malheureusement également un vent qui va activer donc l'apport d'oxygène sur ce feu.
Remember, the situation becomes dangerous below 26% humidity, so below 20%, the conditions are extremely volatile. Droughts force plants to tap into their water reserves to survive. They then release highly flammable gases. Worse, the plants of the Capillon area are very special. It is not really a forest, but a scrubland.
Ce sont en général des arbustes et des herbes qui forment un ensemble de couches de végétation relativement basses. Ces plantes de la garrigue sont particulièrement bien adaptées au feu.
Bush and shrubs make up the scrubland, and to burn these plants, the fire needs a lot less energy than to burn trees. It is like in a chimney. Smaller wood burns more easily than logs, so fire goes a lot faster. That day in Capillon, the fire travelled 7 hectares in 1 hour, and on top of that, the wind was blowing. In summer, the wind in the Côte d'Azur is a firefighter's worst nightmare. Corvette Captain Priol is a naval firefighter for the city of Marseille. On that day, the 22nd of July, he took command of the operations.
Le sinistre progresse à 3% de la vitesse du vent. Donc effectivement, vous pouvez imaginer que pour un vent de 100 km/h, le feu peut se propager à 3000 mètres par heure. Et 1 hectare de pinède qui brûle, ça peut être l'équivalent de la puissance d'une centrale nucléaire.
Remember, once the fire is activated by a spark, it is oxygen from the air which burns the fuel, that is, the vegetation. The more wind there is, the more air and oxygen there is, and the faster the plants are burned. But in July 2009, the wind blowing was not the same as usual.
En règle générale, la ville de Marseille est soumise à un régime de Mistral. Et ici, nous avions un vent de sud-est, effectivement. Donc ce type de feu, nous l'avions jamais rencontré.
The Mistral is a wind which can reach unbelievable speed and make fire uncontrollable. However, for the firemen, the fact that it was not the Mistral blowing on the 22nd of July 2009 was anything but good news. This is because the Mistral is a wind from the northwest, and that day the wind was blowing in exactly the opposite direction. In short, rather than blowing the fire away from Marseille, it brought it towards the city and its hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. If the flames reached the city, the disaster would grow to cataclysmic proportions. For the firefighters on the ground, the stakes were high and the pressure was tremendous. The situation was very dangerous. The landform made movement very difficult. The wind and the dry scrubland allowed the flames to rage.
Fire really blows up. In fact, it will move so fast at that point that in many cases, firefighting forces will pull back because it's very dangerous to be in that kind of condition.
The situation was all the more dangerous because the fire was not moving in only one direction. It grew wider as it advanced. The firefighters risked being surrounded by flames at any moment.
Le feu, c'est pas un point qui se déplace comme un homme à une vitesse qui peut sembler relativement raisonnable, mais c'est un front qui s'étend, avec une tête de feu qui va relativement vite, mais aussi des flancs qui s'élargissent.
The fire moved with the wind. It was the wind which gave the flame front its general direction. What's more, as the fire was fed by the plants that it burned, it went everywhere where it could find fuel. The result was that as the front moved faster, it also expanded from the sides. While the fire brigade managed to contain the flame front, the flanks continued to advance and move beyond them. On the ground, the firemen had to be careful not to get trapped, and that day they lost ground. For Captain Priol, giving up was out of the question. Marseille had to be protected at all costs, so he called for aerial support. From the outset, the closest civil security base was warned. Olivier Le Chevalier is a seasoned pilot who has worked on more than 1,000 fire missions. He was the one who directed the aerial action against the fire of Capignan from his Canadair.
Dès le départ, c'est une course contre la montre, puisque quand le feu est vraiment établi à cause des facteurs aggravants, l'hygrométrie, la force du vent, la température, la sécheresse, eh bien, c'est tellement puissant que nos moyens, même si on avait double ou triple moyens, on ne pourrait pas l'éteindre.
It is all a question of timing. Every minute counts in the fight against fire.
Votre panière à papier prend feu, avec un seau de 10 litres, vous allez l'éteindre. Maintenant, si la panière à papier a mis le feu au rideau et puis à toute la maison, c'est plus 10 litres qu'il va falloir.
The aerial fight began in the Capignan Mountains. The Canadairs do not simply drop their 6,000 litres of water to put out the fire. They try to spread a chemical product in front of the fire. This product is called a retardant and is mixed with water.
Il a pour avantage de rendre plus efficace la pellicule humide qui recouvre la végétation.
Developed by scientists and composed of special salts, polyphosphate salts, this product makes plants much more fire-resistant. To succeed in burning this vegetation, the flames must reach 700 degrees rather than 200 without the retardant.
On va enrober la végétation de ce produit, de ce sel, à l'arrivée du front de flamme. Le front de flamme va, comme on dit, pomper de l'énergie en fait pour essayer de brûler cette végétation et ainsi va perdre de sa puissance.
But for this technique to be effective, it must be monitored. This time in the Capignan Mountains, with factors such as drought, wind and the landform, there is almost no visibility. The fire brigade and the pilots must work in the heart of the smoke. The smoke makes the work of the Canadairs a lot less effective and risks the lives of their teams.
Si jamais ils n'ont pas une visibilité parfaite, si jamais ils n'ont pas l'œil sur les différents obstacles, on risque des accidents.
On évolue très très près du relief, donc la moindre inattention, à 10 mètres près, on peut accrocher un arbre.
Especially in high doses, the smoke generated by wildfire can be toxic because it contains carbon monoxide, vapors and irritating gases. Consequently, the smoke disorients very quickly and can cause severe asphyxia and discomfort. As the flames got dangerously close to the city, water bombers could no longer be used to avoid injuring the inhabitants. No more planes as the fire approached the gates of Marseille. The city had to be protected at all costs. Captain Priol decided to reposition his men around the closest residences, which risked being reached. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. The fire arrived at the La Valbarret district, then descended along the outskirts of the city. At the height of the crisis, 1,000 men and 300 machines were mobilized, as, according to experts, several zones could be affected at the same time. The inhabitants were taken by surprise.
J'étais de sortie, donc j'ai pas fait attention que la colline brûlait. C'est quand j'ai vu le feu en haut de la butte que j'ai compris qu'il y avait le feu qui arrivait sur les 3 ponts.
The Trois Ponts area is a series of cliffs covered in vegetation which hang over its narrow streets with a very concentrated population. The fire brigade arrived, but the task was complicated. The trucks had trouble moving around and there were few water sources.
Le feu descendait sur les maisons, donc on s'est mis en position de protection avec des lances. On se met en appui sur les maisons pour se protéger nous aussi parce qu'on ne va pas s'exposer dans la pinade avec des flammes qui descendaient rapidement.
By spraying the flames, firemen seek to harness the powers of 2 scientific phenomena. First, they try to lower the temperature of the fire. Below 300 degrees, wood does not burn. To do that, they project water as widely as possible. The second scientific phenomenon is even more surprising. The heat transforms water into vapor, and this vapor, which is a gas, replaces the oxygen, and without oxygen, the fire can no longer burn. This technique is very effective, as a single litre of water brought to 100 degrees produces 1,700 litres of water vapour. But for this to work, large quantities of water are required, which was unfortunately not the case in the Trois Ponts area. In Marseille, hours passed, the fire did not weaken, and the firemen continued to struggle.
On retient son souffle. On évite de respirer tellement on a peur. Et puis on voit le feu s'éteindre, alors là, hop, on respire un bon coup, on se dit bon, ben c'est pas pour cette fois. Je dois reconnaître que les pompiers ont fait ce qu'il fallait. Hein.
Although the firefighters could not extinguish the fire, they at least succeeded in channeling it and preventing it from reducing the Trois Ponts area to ashes. The fire stopped 50 centimetres from Marie's house. But the fight was not yet over. Despite nightfall, the weather did not help.
Alors, en général, à ce moment-là, on a des conditions météorologiques qui deviennent plus clémentes avec la tombée du soleil, la température baisse et souvent on a l'humidité de l'air qui réaugmente un petit peu et parfois le vent qui baisse, mais ce n'est pas toujours le cas.
By the end of July 2009, contrary to expectations, the wind did the exact opposite.
Il a eu la particularité d'être au niveau de 13 heures aux environs de 40 km/h. Et ensuite, pendant la nuit, alors qu'en règle générale, le vent a tendance à se calmer, là, il s'est renforcé.
The danger was increasing for the firefighters, who no longer had aerial support and whose visibility was very limited. The wind was growing increasingly stronger and the fire raged. It continued its wild course in the direction of the La Panouse district. And it is here that it did the most damage. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The fire was raging on the slope next to the neighbourhood, a slope covered in pine trees. However, pine has a very special behaviour during fires, a behaviour which makes it a very effective ally for the fire.
Le pin est un client de choix pour le feu, parce qu'en été, en fait, sa teneur en eau est très faible, donc il est très combustible, mais également, on observe le long de son tronc des coulées de résine très inflammables. Et le courant de voir le feu monter, j'allais dire, dans l'arbre grâce à cette résine.
Pine is a species which has developed with the help of fire. It uses it to spread its seeds contained in the pine cones. In fact, the pine cones are sealed shut by this highly flammable resin. Scientists discovered that on contact with heat, they burst, opening up and spreading their seeds over a large area.
Les pines de pin, quand ils vont s'enflammer, souvent ces pines vont éclater et vont être projetés alors à des dizaines, voire des centaines de mètres.
On the night of the 22nd of July 2009, this is exactly what happened to the colonel.
Les pignes sont venues enflammer d'en face. Elles partaient comme des obus. Alors c'est rentré, ça, bon, d'abord une, puis deux. La maison ne s'est pas enflammée tout de suite, puisque des voisins nous ont dit on a d'abord vu sortir de la fumée de chez vous.
The colonel's home faced the pine forest. The pine cones were projected with such force that they easily got into the house.
J'avais une véranda ici avec une baie vitrée. C'était pas des doubles vitrages, c'était des vitres simples. Hein. Bon, c'était facile de passer à travers, et avec les tapis, les meubles, tout ça.
Oui, tout.
Toute ouverture, une fenêtre laissée ouverte ou un volet qui ne serait pas fermé et une vitre qui explose sous l'effet de la chaleur. Et dès qu'il y a cette ouverture, les particules incandescentes vont rentrer en masse dans la maison et allumer tout ce qui peut être combustible dans une maison, que ce soit le tissu d'un fauteuil, un rideau. Et quand ça se voit, c'est trop tard.
The next morning at 8 o'clock, the fire was finally stopped from spreading further, but it took another 4 days for the fire to be considered officially extinguished after having burned 1,000 hectares of land. This delay after the visible suppression of the fire is due to an astonishing phenomenon, root fires.
That fire actually follows where it has fuel, and so it will follow down into the ground and burn along the roots of the trees. And then if the weather conditions change and become favorable again for the fire to spark up, all of a sudden it may come back up again, and the fire that you thought you had out will start burning again and making a new run.
Once extinguished, the fire left behind charred trunks and scorched branches. These scars give an indication of the severity of the damage caused, but also of the chances of survival of the trees. Because certain species have developed special forms in order to resist fires. With its very thick bark, oak cork protects the living tissue of its trunk from heat. Other trees grow quickly to gain height and escape the flames. Sometimes they even naturally prune themselves by getting rid of their lower branches. After a fire, however, survivors are weakened for several years. Some trees never grow again. But some species deploy strategies to rise from the ashes. This is the case with most hardwoods that are capable of growing new branches from charred trunks. As for the majority of softwoods, they regenerate when the seeds that they have released germinate after a fire. For the Colonna, this fire was a disaster, but the damage could have been a lot worse. Firefighters managed a remarkable operation in the protection of Marseille from the flames. But unfortunately, fires threatening cities are likely to become more and more frequent. These giant fires are causing increasing damage all over the globe. Scientists are worried for the future. But why are forest fires becoming bigger and more destructive? What does the future hold for us? Experts consider the likely evolution of these disasters can already be observed in one European country, Portugal.
Au Portugal, on est déjà dans un phénomène qui est l'étape d'après, qu'on connaîtra peut-être, je n'espère pas, mais peut-être en France dans les années à venir, qui est ce phénomène de grands feux simultanés. Quand on regarde les images satellitaires de ces dates, on voit plusieurs colonnes de fumée, visibles de satellites, qui partent du Portugal continental et qui vont jusque assez loin sur l'océan Atlantique. C'est vraiment impressionnant.
Fernando Ribeiro is from Portugal. During the summer in his village, fires have become incredibly common.
C'est un truc qui vit avec nous tous les ans, il y a un feu. C'était normal. Je me rappelle de passer en voiture à côté de feux où on sent la chaleur vraiment, même à travers les vitres et tout. On entend souvent les pompiers, on voit la fumée au loin. C'est un truc qui est complètement habituel.
Fires in Portugal are nothing new, but these last few years, the numbers have soared. In 2016, 160,000 hectares were consumed by flames. That's nearly 3 times that of the station fire in Los Angeles. And the worst is that hundreds of fires can start at the same time, all over the country. The Portuguese climate is very similar to that of the south of France, and the plants have similar origins. Yet this country sees the number of its forest fires continuously increasing.
Entre 2003 et 2005, 2 années catastrophiques, 2 saisons catastrophiques de feu au Portugal, le Portugal brûle 23% de sa surface forestière. C'est absolument énorme.
A quarter of Portugal's forests, the size of Corsica, has gone up in smoke in 3 years. So what explains this magnitude? To understand, one only has to look at what happened in this country during the summer of 2016. On the 8th of August 2016, 35 fires raged around the city of Porto, while about 100 fires ravaged the north of the country. And the fire went beyond the limits of the city, unlike in Marseille. This time it entered the city of Funchal and almost destroyed its historic quarter.
Quand on voit l'ampleur des dommages, 110 maisons détruites, plus de 200 installations impactées, ça témoigne d'un nouveau type de feu auquel il faut faire face, auquel il faut se préparer.
For a large city to be partly destroyed by wildfire in Europe. This had never happened before, so what happened on the 8th of August? The summer of 2016 in Portugal was marked by intense heat and drought, even more than usual. In recent years, southern Europe has experienced warming which makes the weather conditions more and more extreme. Unfortunately, perfect conditions for forest fires.
Tous les facteurs finalement vont dans le même sens, à la fois l'augmentation des températures qui augmente le risque et aussi l'augmentation des conditions de sécheresse.
Another factor was added to these very dangerous conditions, a factor that changed everything.
Il y a eu notamment un épisode, on peut résumer par un épisode de type sirocco, avec un vent très chaud venu du sud, venant d'Afrique du Nord.
Once again, it is the wind which turned the situation into a nightmare, and not just any wind, the sirocco wind. Characterized by intense heat and dryness, it originates in the heart of the Sahara. When it blew over Portugal on the 8th of August, the slightest spark caused many disasters.
Foi quase uma cena de terror.
My mom is screaming, my dad is crying.
Aquilo está de uma tristeza. Está até incêndio.
Leave your house, be careful because the fire is in your house.
That day on the island of Madeira, a fire started just outside the regional capital, Funchal, and burned a large part of the historic quarter in just a few hours. How? In fact, the fire was carried to the heart of the city by a highly flammable species of tree, the Eucalyptus.
Moi, j'ai toujours connu les eucalyptus. Il y a un petit peu de sapin, il y a un petit peu de chêne, mais c'est surtout l'espèce qui pousse le mieux.
Eucalyptus is a species found all over Portugal, but it is not originally from this country. It comes from the other side of the planet, Australia.
L'eucalyptus australien a été planté au Portugal par des industries papetières pour faire du bois énergie ou du bois d'industrie.
Eucalyptus and fire have a long history. In its home country, it is the cause of immense fires which run riot every year during the dry season. Its characteristics, well known to experts, make it a very good ally for fire. Fernando knows something about this. He fought the fire at the gates of his village.
C'était au mois d'août. On était en vacances avec des amis qui étaient venus à la maison et ça s'est déclenché tout à côté de la maison, à 300 mètres de la maison.
Fernando went immediately to the scene. He noticed that the leaves and pieces of eucalyptus bark covering the ground were the prey to the flames.
Il y a le feu qui s'élargit, on tape dessus, là où quand il y a une flamme, on tape dessus pour l'éteindre et la calmer. Après l'extincteur, j'ai réussi à éteindre des foyers un peu plus importants, mais après on est très vite impuissant parce que il y a tellement de choses qui brûlent par terre et tout que ça va très vite.
Scientists know that eucalyptus leaves decompose very slowly. In summer, this very dry bedding that covers the ground is just waiting for an opportunity to ignite. Fortunately, the firemen arrived very quickly. Fernando was lucky. But in the city of Funchal in 2016, it was another of the eucalyptus's characteristics that triggered the disaster.
La particularité de l'eucalyptus quand il brûle, c'est de produire des morceaux d'écorce, des lambeaux d'écorce. Et ces particules incandescentes, ces écorces qui brûlent, ont pu être transportées sur plusieurs centaines de mètres.
The shreds of bark are very light. Remember, pine cones explode on contact with fire and are projected a few tens of meters. With eucalyptus bark and leaves, it's much worse. The distance can reach hundreds of meters. Driven by the wind, the burning bark landed in the middle of the city, sometimes even in houses with open windows. These buildings immediately caught fire.
Il faut imaginer une pluie de cendres incandescentes, donc qui tombe au hasard sur tout un périmètre, et puis une maison abandonnée, vitres cassées, porte ouverte, la ruine prend feu et les maisons alentours sont menacées.
For locals and tourists, the situation is catastrophic. There is smoke everywhere.
L'air est très vite asphyxiant, c'est poussiéreux partout, c'est étouffant.
That day, Funchal was on the brink of chaos, especially since the island of Madeira is 1,000 kilometers from the rest of Portugal, making it impossible for reinforcements to arrive. In the end, the city owed its salvation to a change in weather. The wind eventually dropped, and the moisture went up, which stopped the fire. But in the rest of Portugal, the fires continued for weeks. And with global warming, we risk knowing more and more of disasters like those that ravaged Portugal during the summer of 2016.
On fait déjà le constat que les feux de forêt augmentent et on fait même l'attribution, dans certaines études, de l'augmentation de ce risque de feux forestiers avec le changement climatique.
In France, the current upheavals are irreversible and risk changing many things.
Dans le cas de la France, on fait le constat que le risque d'incendie que l'on a actuellement dans le sud-est de la France pourrait s'étendre dès 2040 à la forêt des Landes et en 2060 à la forêt de Sologne.
La Sologne, just outside of Paris. The situation is likely to be all the more disastrous as the forests of the northern half of France are populated by species of trees which are not adapted to fire and which therefore risk not being able to regenerate. This also means that prevention and control plans will have to be thoroughly reviewed.
Il faut vraiment réagir pour ne pas devoir gérer des situations catastrophiques du type du station fire, mais cette fois-ci en Europe.
For scientists, the extension of the concerned area is not the only effect of global warming. It is already occurring during wildfire seasons, and this is everywhere on the planet.
When fire season in the past used to start, let's say in Los Angeles, it would start roughly around May and be hazardous all the way into October. We're now seeing those fuels and that condition dry out in March and April, sometimes even early March.
In recent years, the number of forest fires has already seen a sharp increase, so much so that according to some studies, they are responsible for 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. They participate in global warming, which in turn multiplies forest fires. Another cycle has begun, which is no longer natural.